You have been taught that love means swallowing your truth, that being a good man requires accepting the unacceptable, that keeping peace is worth sacrificing your soul. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer discovered in the darkest chapter of human history that there comes a moment when obedience itself becomes the greatest act of betrayal against everything you were meant to become. The comfortable lie you live every day, the one that tells you her happiness is more important than your integrity, the same lie that convinced an entire nation to surrender their moral compass for the illusion of belonging, is slowly killing the man you could have been. What Bonhoeffer learned in his final moments before the gallows, what cost him everything but saved his soul, will shatter every assumption you have about love, loyalty, and what it truly means to be a man who stands for something greater than his own comfort. There exists a comfortable darkness in never having to think, never having to choose, never having to bear the weight of your own decisions. Bonhoeffer understood this seductive pull when he watched an entire nation surrender their moral compass for the illusion of safety and belonging. In your relationships, this same poison flows when you find yourself nodding along to her unreasonable demands, swallowing your truth to keep the peace. The man who stops questioning becomes the man who stops existing. She knows exactly how to make compliance feel like love, how to dress your surrender in the language of devotion and partnership. You tell yourself that keeping her happy is noble, that avoiding conflict shows maturity, that a real man sacrifices his needs for harmony. But Bonhoeffer learned in the darkest chapter of human history that there comes a moment when obedience transforms from virtue into moral cowardice. The comfortable path of least resistance becomes the highway to your own destruction. The most dangerous lie you can believe is that peace at any price is worth paying. When you stop pushing back against her emotional manipulation, when you accept her double standards without question, when you silence your inner voice to maintain her approval, you become complicit in your own diminishment. Bonhoeffer chose the gallows rather than live as a complicit witness to evil, because he understood that some forms of obedience are actually acts of betrayal against everything you were meant to become. The moment you witness her cruelty and say nothing, you become her silent partner in the destruction of your own soul. Bonhoeffer watched good men remain quiet while darkness consumed their world, and he understood that silence in the face of wrong is not neutrality, but active participation. Your silence when she tears you down becomes the very foundation upon which her tyranny is built. Every time you swallow her insults, every time you accept her gaslighting without protest, you hand her another tool to use against you. She counts on your silence because she knows it transforms you from victim into accomplice. The man who refuses to speak truth becomes the man who enables lies to flourish in his own home. Bonhoeffer realized that the greatest evil is not committed by monsters, but by ordinary people who choose comfort over courage, peace over principle. When you remain silent as she systematically destroys your confidence, your friendships, your dreams, you become responsible for the outcome of your own life. Your silence is not keeping the peace, it is feeding the very beast that devours your authenticity. Bonhoeffer understood that complicity wears many masks, but the most common is the face of the man who simply says nothing when everything inside him screams for justice. The choice to remain silent when truth demands a voice is the choice to become an enemy to your own spirit. Your silence does not make you noble, it makes you responsible for every wound that follows. Bonhoeffer warned against cheap grace, the deadly comfort of forgiveness without repentance, acceptance without transformation, love without accountability. In your relationships, this manifests as the endless cycle of her destructive behavior, followed by your immediate forgiveness, creating a toxic pattern where she never faces the consequences of her actions. You tell yourself that unconditional Love means accepting everything, but Bonhoeffer understood that grace without cost becomes permission for evil to flourish. When you forgive without requiring change, you become the architect of your own repeated suffering. She has learned to weaponize your capacity for forgiveness, turning your greatest strength into the very chain that binds you to her destructive patterns. Each time she crosses a boundary and you simply forgive without consequence, you teach her that your boundaries are meaningless. Bonhoeffer recognized that costly grace demands transformation, that true love requires the beloved to become worthy of the love they receive. The woman who never pays the price for her cruelty will never stop being cruel. The path of cheap grace leads inevitably to resentment, bitterness, and the slow death of everything authentic within you. When you offer forgiveness that costs her nothing, you create a relationship built on the foundation of your own self-betrayal. Bonhoeffer chose costly grace even when it led to his death because he understood that some prices must be paid for truth to live. Your love becomes meaningful only when it demands that both of you become worthy of what you claim to share. Bonhoeffer discovered that there comes a moment when love itself demands rebellion against the very person you care about most. When her behavior becomes destructive to both of you, when her patterns poison the relationship beyond recognition, responsible love requires you to act against her immediate desires for the sake of something higher. This is not cruelty, but the deepest form of care, the willingness to risk her anger, her tears, her threats, because you refuse to enable her own self-destruction. The man who truly loves will sometimes become the enemy of the woman he loves most. She will interpret your resistance as betrayal, your boundaries as abandonment, your refusal to enable as proof that you never cared at all. Bonhoeffer faced this same accusation from those who called his resistance to evil an act of treachery against his own people. But he understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone's path toward their own ruin. When you stop enabling her toxic patterns, you give her the only gift that matters, the chance to face herself honestly. Responsible action requires you to choose the difficult path of truth over the comfortable path of compliance. When you refuse to absorb her emotional chaos, when you stop rescuing her from the consequences of her choices, when you stand firm against her manipulation, you create the space where real transformation becomes possible. Bonhoeffer knew that responsible love sometimes looks like betrayal to those who benefit from irresponsible love. Your willingness to be misunderstood becomes the price you pay for her potential freedom. Bonhoeffer's prison letters reveal the terrifying necessity of choosing truth over the warmth of belonging, principle over the comfort of acceptance. In those cold cells, he discovered that the man who stands for something must be prepared to stand alone, abandoned by those who once called themselves his allies. Your relationship will demand this same courage when you realize that choosing your authentic self means losing her approval, her affection, perhaps her presence entirely. The price of integrity is often the end of everything you thought you wanted. She will use your need for connection as a weapon against your convictions, making you choose between her love and your truth. Bonhoeffer watched friends abandon him when his principles became inconvenient, when his resistance threatened their comfortable positions. The woman who truly loves you will never ask you to betray yourself for her comfort, but the woman who needs you will demand exactly this sacrifice. Your willingness to stand alone becomes the test of whether your love is real or merely another form of dependency. The loneliness of standing for truth is brutal, but the alternative is the slow suicide of becoming someone you despise. Bonhoeffer chose the scaffold rather than compromise his soul because he understood that some forms of belonging require the death of everything authentic within you. When she forces you to choose between her approval and your principles, she reveals the true nature of what you share. The man who cannot stand alone will never truly stand with anyone. Bonhoeffer understood that the most insidious chains are those we cannot see, the invisible bonds that convince us our captivity is actually freedom. In your relationship, these chains manifest as her subtle conditioning, the way she slowly trains you to doubt your own perceptions, to question your own worth, to believe that her version of reality is the only one that matters. Ethical resistance begins with the recognition that you have been psychologically enslaved, that your mind has become her territory, and that breaking free requires more courage than staying bound. She has mastered the art of making you complicit in your own imprisonment, convincing you that your cage is actually a sanctuary, that your limitations are actually preferences. Bonhoeffer recognized this same psychological manipulation in the way entire populations learned to love their own oppression, to defend the very systems that destroyed them. The moment you begin to see through her manipulation is the moment your real battle begins, because she will fight harder to keep you imprisoned than you initially fight to be free. Your liberation demands that you refuse to participate in the elaborate fiction she has constructed around your relationship. When you stop pretending that her cruelty is love, her control is care, her manipulation is concern, you begin the painful process of psychological emancipation. Bonhoeffer chose death over the comfortable lie of collaboration because he understood that some freedoms can only be won through the complete rejection of everything that feels safe. Your mind is the battlefield where your future will be determined. Bonhoeffer carried the crushing weight of understanding that his actions would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of those around him. That moral responsibility extends far beyond personal consequences. In your relationship, this same weight settles on your shoulders when you realize that your compliance with her destructive patterns makes you responsible for the man you become, the example you set, the legacy you leave. Every time you accept what should not be accepted, you become accountable for the slow erosion of your own character and the enabling of her worst impulses. She will try to convince you that her behavior is beyond your control, that you bear no responsibility for the toxic dynamics between you, that your only job is to love and accept whatever she brings. But Bonhoeffer understood that we become responsible for the evil we fail to resist, complicit in the destruction we choose not to prevent. Your willingness to absorb her emotional violence without consequence creates the very environment where that violence can flourish. The man who refuses to hold others accountable becomes accountable for their continued destructive behavior. The weight of this responsibility is almost unbearable because it forces you to confront your own role in creating the hell you inhabit. When you realize that your enabling has made you partially responsible for your own suffering, when you understand that your silence has contributed to her sense of entitlement, you face the most difficult truth of all. Bonhoeffer chose to act, despite the crushing weight of responsibility, because he understood that awareness without action transforms knowledge into moral cowardice. Your responsibility becomes your freedom when you finally choose to bear it consciously. Bonhoeffer discovered the paradox that haunts every conscious man, the moment when submission to authority transforms from virtue into moral failure, when obedience itself becomes the greatest act of rebellion against everything sacred. In your relationship, this transformation occurs when your compliance with her unreasonable demands begins to violate your deepest values, when keeping her happy requires you to betray your own integrity. The man who obeys without question becomes the man who participates in his own spiritual murder, trading his soul for the illusion of peace. She has trained you to believe that resistance equals selfishness, that questioning her authority means you lack love, that a good man always submits to keep harmony alive. But Bonhoeffer learned that some forms of submission are actually acts of violence against the divine spark within you, that there are moments when saying no becomes a sacred duty. When your obedience enables her worst impulses, when your compliance allows toxicity to flourish, your submission becomes complicity in the destruction of everything you were meant to protect. The most dangerous moment in any relationship arrives when you realize that being good, according to her definition, requires you to be evil, according to your own conscience. Bonhoeffer faced execution rather than participate in a system that demanded the death of his moral center, because he understood that some forms of obedience are actually betrayals of the highest order. Your willingness to disobey when obedience requires self-betrayal becomes the measure of your spiritual maturity, the proof that you still possess a soul worth saving. Bonhoeffer understood that following your deepest values will cost you relationships that were never meant to survive, that authentic discipleship to your highest self demands the sacrifice of everything that keeps you comfortable but spiritually dead. In your relationship, this price manifests as the gradual realization that being true to yourself will eventually make you incompatible with her need for control, her demand for compliance, her requirement that you remain small enough to fit into her limited vision of who you should be. The path of authenticity is littered with the remains of connections that could not survive your commitment to truth. She will interpret your growth as abandonment, your boundaries as cruelty, your refusal to remain stagnant as proof that you no longer love her the way she needs to be loved. Bonhoeffer faced the same accusations from those who benefited from his previous compliance, who needed him to remain predictable, manageable, controllable. The woman who truly loves you will celebrate your evolution even when it threatens her sense of security. But the woman who needs you will fight your transformation with everything she possesses. The price of authentic discipleship is the loneliness of outgrowing the people who defined themselves by your limitations, who built their identity around your willingness to remain less than you could become. When you choose to follow your deepest calling, regardless of who you lose in the process, you discover what Bonhoeffer knew in his final moments. Some prices must be paid not because they guarantee happiness, but because they guarantee that you will meet death having lived as the person you were always meant to be, rather than the person others needed you to remain. Bonhoeffer's ultimate sacrifice teaches us that some bonds must be severed for truth to live, that the death of false peace is the only path to authentic resurrection in our relationships and in our souls. The comfortable lie of harmony built on your silence, your compliance, your self-betrayal must burn completely before anything real can emerge from its ashes. When you finally choose truth over tranquility, when you allow the false peace to die, you create the space where genuine love becomes possible, even if that love exists only between you and your own integrity. She will mourn the death of the man who enabled her worst impulses, who absorbed her chaos without question, who sacrificed his truth to maintain her comfort. But Bonhoeffer understood that resurrection requires crucifixion, that new life demands the complete death of everything that came before. The ending of your false peace will feel like the ending of love itself, but it is actually the beginning of the only love that matters. The love that can survive the weight of truth and emerge stronger for having been tested. From the ashes of your collapsed illusions rises the man you were always meant to become, scarred by the fire but purified by its flames. The false peace that dies was never peace at all, but merely the absence of honest conflict, the silence of a soul too afraid to speak its truth. Bonhoeffer chose the gallows because he understood that some deaths lead to life, that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Your willingness to let false peace die becomes your gateway to the only peace worth having, the peace that comes from living and dying as yourself. Bonhoeffer chose death over the comfortable lie of compliance because he understood that some forms of obedience are actually acts of self-murder, that the man who cannot say no when everything inside him screams for justice becomes complicit in his own destruction. The question that will haunt you tonight is this: when you look in the mirror tomorrow morning, will you see a man who stands for his truth or someone who has traded his soul for the illusion of peace? Share in the comments the moment you realized your silence had become complicity. Tell us about the time you chose comfort over courage, because your story might be the key that unlocks another man's prison. If this awakened something buried deep within you, if you felt the weight of responsibility settling on your shoulders, subscribe to this channel and join the brotherhood of men who refuse to die spiritually while their hearts still beat.